Everyone can see a significant shift towards systems that don't just generate content and insights, but are also taking action in the real world. What is the material change in the last 12 months technologically that's actually making Agentic AI in these systems a reality?
Many of these noisy things would be a huge efficiency gain and eventually focus the operator on things that really matter.
If you create micro agents that handle specific outcomes, keep this room comfortable, enabling a non-deterministic ability to make a room comfortable versus a step-by-step logic sequence, it's a whole new paradigm.
Who takes the blame if something goes wrong in that decision making?
A human in the loop is going to be critical for years to come.
People think, how are jobs going to be impacted today by AI?
Those that embrace it really become force multipliers.
What we probably would have called sci-fi in movies not so long ago and now actually being reality.
The real question is, who is going to be the ones that change the world?
My dream would be that with the help of AI, and we actually go back to where we started. Lighting is as simple as switching on one switch.
Hey everyone, welcome to the IoT Podcast. I'm your host today, Gilbert, and as usual in this episode, we'll be diving into the tech shaping the Internet of Things. Make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and don't forget to turn on notifications so that you never miss an episode.
Before we get into today's episode, just a quick one. If you're planning to go to any IoT events this year, make sure the Things Conference 2026 is on your list. It's taking place in Amsterdam this September, where there's over 2,000 industry professionals who will be arriving for networking, demos, talks, speakers, the future of IoT, and what we should expect to see in coming years. And not only that, we'll be there too. We'll be filming some content, catching up with some old faces, and hopefully meeting a lot of you too. So if you're coming along, make sure you come and say hello. We'd love to meet some of our listeners and viewers in real life. And if you're an active IoT buyer, you can register for free. Otherwise, go to our website, theiotpodcast.com, where you can get a 30% discount code. Just use the code 5VMTTC26 when you book your ticket. And if you want to know a bit more about what to expect, check back to the episode I filmed with Winky Giesman, the founder of the Things Industries and the Things Conference, where we talk about what you can expect this year. Right, let's get into today's episode.
Welcome back to the IoT Podcast. I'm your host, Gilbert, head of 5V Tech. And today we've got an exciting episode, which I've been looking forward to recording for a while, actually, since we've been speaking about it, which is exploring the intersection between AI in the physical world, but specifically the potential of agentic AI in IoT and physical systems. Now, there's been a meteoric rise, as everyone can see, in AI and digital environments over the last 12 plus months, but a significant shift has been towards systems that don't just generate content and insights, but are also making decisions and taking action in the real world. So to dive into this topic with me today, I'm excited to be joined by Dan Levine, VP of AI, Data and IoT Platforms at Signify, and Hans Nikol, Head of IoT, also at Signify. So Dan, Hans, welcome. It's great to have you here. And just as a bit of an introduction, I'm sure listeners are aware of Signify, but if not, Signify operate at significant scale in smart home and commercial lighting and building smart systems with, I think when we discussed, over 150 million or possibly more connected devices across consumer, commercial, public environments, from Philips Hue in the home all the way through to buildings and even wider scale in cities. So interesting thing about Signify is you're operating across the full stack from device to cloud. So hopefully we have some good insight on where that's affecting with Agentic AI today. So before we kind of break things down and go into it, it'd be great to start with a quick introduction from both Dan, Hans, and maybe just some initial thoughts on priming up the conversation we're going to have today.
My name is Dan Levine. I lead, as mentioned, AI, Data, and IoT Platforms here at Signify. I've been in the IoT space for over 2 decades now, and most recently, especially with the advent of AI and real large-scale data infrastructure, taking all of that really interesting data that these sensors and connected devices have been producing and delivering real outcomes and value has been my top focus. So very excited to be here and looking forward to see where this conversation goes.
Great.
So, Nikol, I've been with the company for 30 years, so I outnumber you by 1 decade. Today we are Signify. We used to be Philips Lighting, one of the large 3 lighting companies. Now you would think, why is lighting an interesting vertical in IoT? Well, I always say it's 3 things. It's plenty. So I think by any counts, you have probably 50, 60 billion light points in this world and counting. So, if you only connected a fraction of that, it would be a very substantial IoT. The other one is the position. IoT is obviously all about sensing, and later on AI has to make use of the sensing data to provide information. And lighting is usually uniquely positioned, outdoor, indoor, to capture that. And the last one is power, right? So obviously you want to continuously feed sensing data, and for that it needs to be powered, and that is lighting typically all the time. I think most listeners, I would assume, know Philips Hue, which is our product, and has quite some widespread consumer application. And so here we are.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you both. And I thought maybe to start with, it would be good to prime things by getting a few definitions out there. So Edge AI, physical AI has become obviously a huge buzzword. I guess the technology is, in its simple form, been around for quite some time with TinyML, and even before that, kind of really basic single model inference on devices. So I guess to start with, when we look at systems like the kinds that Signify is working at, what really does Agentic AI mean in that context and in the context of Signify and Philips Hue?
So from my point of view, I think there's a few different dimensions that it covers. We have our physical products in the various domains, very impactful in the home, being that kind of the dream has been for these systems that are ultra personalized and respond to your needs without having to have so much overhead and configuration and tweaking, and with AI and being able to do that on the edge where it's private and secure really enables those types of experiences that companies like ours have been trying to deliver and delivering on for a long time now. In the commercial side of things, there's huge opportunities. The biggest issue in commercial is the variations and permutations of embedded systems that are running. There is really, every building is a custom configuration, and being able to use AI to kind of understand and contextualize and add semantics to the data that's coming out and then reason on top of that data is also a big aspiration for anybody who's been in the IoT space. So that's 2. And then the third is really around our internal operations, how we serve customers. So making it easier to work with us and find the right products and get the support that our customers need to help them enjoy and experience the capabilities that we are delivering.
And maybe let me add to that, because you mentioned Edge AI versus, let's say AI in the cloud. I think if you look at this massive scale of deployed devices, right, and even if a fraction of them is IoT, you can imagine if you have constant sensor feeds, let's say you have an outdoor lighting situation, like we have a parking lot or a street, and even if the sensor is fairly simple, it creates such an abundance of data. And, if only a fraction of that needs to be transported over a network, it's a total overload very quickly. So having AI in the edge to compress and just send the necessary useful information. It's not just even compression, right? But already making sense at the edge.
Removing the noise,
right? Which probably most cases, you have 90% noise, if not more, and just send the relevant ping, basically. I think that's a huge gain, and I think will help to dramatically advance the number of use cases that can be addressed moving forward.
Well, it's interesting, and I think, Dan, as you mentioned, when we talk about what's been a kind of aspiration of IoT systems now becoming possible, what do you both think is probably the main material change that's happened in the last 12 months technologically that's actually making Agentic AI in these systems a reality?
For me, really, it's, if you had this first flash moment of ChatGPT, all of us remember, right, back in 23. But that was nice to have, and all of a sudden you had this brain. For me, Agentic AI is really another one, probably even more impactful. Because now, before it's like, okay, you could argue it's a bit of another search engine, right? And it gives you the tailored answer. But now you have agents that can actually do something. They can perform actions in a logical sequence So, and of course, that is already used today in a lot of enterprise applications. But if you think this forward, right, that each of these edge nodes eventually can transport that intelligence, they can do something, act on it. I think the potential is just enormous. And for me, that's really also eventually the productivity gain that can be accomplished only with agents.
I agree. I think the reasoning ability, the fact that you can kind of bake intelligence into these agents, and if you create, say, micro agents, as you will, that handle specific outcomes that they're looking to achieve, like keep this room comfortable. That type of request involves a few different things. One, what kind of room is it? Is anybody in the room? And what does really comfortable mean? The fact that it used to, prior to really agentic and kind of these language models, to write that type of control code would take a very extensive amount of time. And then the tweaking and the adjusting. And once you have it locked in, that's the reality. It's locked in. There's no changing. So enabling a kind of a non-deterministic ability to make a room comfortable versus a step-by-step logic sequence, it's a whole new paradigm.
And when it comes to, like you said, the difference now between having to kind of program things in closed logic step by step to now it being a bit more of a neural kind of decision making, I guess also brings into focus where there may have been a bit of a ceiling hit in the traditional kind of dashboard analytics and insights. So today, when we think more about how it works, what are the kinds of things that agents are going to be able to enable building management or building automation systems to do that wasn't possible in the kind of approach we had up until recently?
You triggered a good word, if I may, dashboard, right? So if you look at building management, the standard practice, I would say, for the last 5 to 10 years was, you observe functions in a building and you display it on the dashboard. Then you have an operator sitting in a building or remote, right? And it has, I don't know how many screens, observing all of these dashboards. People hate dashboards. I think at least that's our finding, right? First of all, a dashboard just displays information and, it's up upon the operator to act on the information displayed on the dashboard. So it's also, comes with a lot of information trading. And now if you have an agent, first of all, you take away the dashboard and you go immediately into action. There's no reason why an agent shouldn't perform a simple action that before was displayed on a dashboard, and now you can immediately act upon. And many, I think you mentioned, let's say, well-being in a building. That's a summary of many temperature, its humidity, its noise, its lighting, obviously. Many of these actions, if you compartmentalize them, are fairly simple actions you can tune to make it comfortable. All of them can be done by agents.
And I would say from the cognitive load that a building manager, building operator, there's these buildings, they're in many cases are aging and they have these systems that were built that have issues. And diagnosing those issues can be a real challenge. So having agents that are augmenting and looking into problems and coming up with potential fixes, and even as Hans mentioned, taking action, even calling in the right people to come repair the issue versus a disaster happening, I think is going to have a really strong place. Security is another area. For security operators, it's really hard to observe and keep track of everything going on, but having these agents that are able to look for anomalous behavior or something that is not correct, and ultimately, historically, coding that in logic, in line coding, saying, hey, I'm looking for this, was really not effective. And you just never got it right. But having an agent that you could say, hey, look at this environment, make sure that the temperature is always correct, that the lights are on when people are in the room, that there's nothing that is out of ordinary from a security standpoint. You can give it that kind of instruction. And as Hans mentioned, it'll ping you if it finds an issue, and other than that, it's quiet. So I think that's really an area that's going to become more and more prevalent.
And I guess, like you mentioned, Hans, the sustainability aspect comes out in that from energy consumption, where rather than having to constantly feed back a continuous stream for a decision to be made more centrally, it can actually, like you said, transmit what's actually needed. And aside from that, you maybe don't hear as much. And that maybe comes back to an interesting point around the hierarchy in this. So where is it that agents actually sit in the system? Is it that you are effectively swapping out the overall building operator with an agent, or is it actually that they're on maybe the device level or the zone level within a building or a whole building, or even actually being coordinated on a wider level? Do you think at each of those layers there's going to be an equal opportunity for kind of agents to play a role, or do you think it might be higher up in the chain?
Well, I would say, at least in the beginning, I think they will take away all of the tedious decisions that I would say an operator just hates to work around, right? Which probably today still takes 90% of his time, or which are simple things like, error messages, that happen, and they often are wrong, they're wrong, then, just you need to reset, or it's a real thing that could have an easy fix and could be fixed by an agent, right? So many of these noisy things, if that already was taken care of, I think would be a huge efficiency gain and would, eventually focus the operator on things that really matter, right? More fundamental decisions where you still need a human brain to comply with. So I would say, at least for the next few years, I would see, the agents working their way up, right, in the end. Of course, you never know where it ends, right? But for now, I think that's such a vast load of tasks that need to be accomplished. So I think the agents have a while, to work around that.
I was speaking to someone the other day about that, which is it's not just a binary, isn't there going to be someone sat, in a room looking at stuff, but someone described it to me a bit more. You might have a situation like Jarvis from Iron Man, right? So you still have someone there ultimately that's taking a high level decision, but you've got someone that's taking all the background, ultimately taking commands, feeding back information, and more of an interactive kind of co-ownership system, which is interesting, and I guess comes down to that question around autonomy. And are we talking about something that could be completely fully automated at a building level, or something that's assistive, and maybe what the implications are when we talk about it being a black box, or who takes the blame if something goes wrong in that decision making?
Eventually, most of these systems will be very highly autonomous. However, it's going to take time to get to that point, and a human in the loop is going to be critical for years to come in many domains. The key is really building the trust and having that auditability and traceability of all reasoning and decisions that were made, not just to go back and look why a decision or why an autonomous system made that decision, but to use it to improve its decision making for the future. That feedback loop and that circle around keeping track of everything that's being done and then adjusting the way that it's operating is absolutely critical to get to highly autonomous systems.
Maybe let me add to that. I think a very important boundary condition is security. Right? So if you talk about a building, and it's increasingly autonomously managed, that also means, it's, vulnerable. And, to shield that, today, at least in building management, right, you have already the network, for example, LoRaWAN or so, that is completely isolated from any other building function. So at least you have a physical detached between other networks and the building management network.
BACnet
or BACnet, right? But now if you add on top of that intelligence, right, and the autonomy of the decisions that are made on the information that's being fed out of these networks, you have to have similar, precautions, because, if you have hacking events or whatever, and you actually can shut down a building, or you can shut down a city, right, or the traffic lights or the lights, right, of course, has huge implications.
Yeah, well, this is, really those kind of conversations where it starts to get into what we probably would have called sci-fi in movies not so long ago, and now actually being, reality. Those kind of horror situations where you could be trapped by a rogue AI or some kind of, presence that's actually got physical control of every part of a building. But it might be the air, it might be airflow, air control, elevators. Not to turn people off to the prospects of building management systems, but it's always an interesting thing to think about. And I think, one of the final things I was going to bring back on when it comes to us talking under the hood, kind of how these things are working is, and I forgot to mention it earlier, but when you said, Dan, moving from the need to have to program step by step kind of control logic, where you might actually be relying on learned behavior over time, and more of a kind of evolving system. What impact do you think that's going to have on the people or the whole kind of section of engineers at the moment who really kind of specialize in being able to build those systems on the assumption that we can't just have a system learn it?
Then I think that's a great one for you because you have a large engineering team here.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because at this point, for the foreseeable future, until really we're at the beginning of a lot of this technology, even though for those that are in it, it feels like it's everywhere. The reality is that the actual deployment footprint is quite low.
Yeah.
And to get to a higher deployment, it's going to require the engineers, the people with the actual domain expertise to, say, train and iterate on these tailored solutions. And I honestly think that those that embrace it really become force multipliers, right? It multiplies their abilities. It does create a lot more work for them too, though. I have engineers that are now using pure agentic development, and it creates 10 times the amount of code and it's 10 times the amount of work. And the barrier to delivering outcomes is shorter now. I mean, it's less. There's less of a barrier, but those that are trained and that understand these domains, whichever domain of engineering that is, there's a high value for them to leverage these technologies and really make a bigger impact on the work they're doing.
What I'm excited about is also, if you look on the application side, take in Europe, for example, this EPBD, that's a mandate from the European Union,
yes,
to have energy saving in also small and medium-sized buildings. It's rolling out in steps now, 26 and 2030, so ever smaller buildings should participate. If you look, and we are looking in that space, right, the variety across the European Union, each country has different flavors of that law. Then you have an endless variety of these buildings. So if you imagine eventually you want to tailor all of these agent processes to all of these variations, I think you can only do it there. And so I think, however, that means a lot of programming for, to tailor these agents to these various variations. So I think we're not going to run out of work for that anytime soon.
No, it's. I think, like you said, the rate of these actually being deployed on a commercial scale is still quite far behind what people see, in generative tools, right? And things will evolve. I think I don't know quite where the statistic comes from, and everyone says how much you can't always trust it, but I think it was something like 80% of the job titles that we have these days didn't exist in the 1980s, the 1970s. Yeah. So people, I don't know don't quote me on that, but it's something you can kind of see where I'm going with that. And I think you will see the same thing, right? People think, how are jobs going to be impacted today by AI? Well, it's also going to create a lot more trust-based roles, I think, where we have to have a human in the loop, doing a slightly different job than the hands-on work.
Hopefully it doesn't get to the George Jetson where you're just basically a human just pressing a single button.
Yeah. That'll take well, then you've got the whole disutility of work issue, right? And then do people even need to? Well, that brings us nicely on to impacts and I guess some use cases as well. So we spoke a lot about this when we were leading up to this episode. So out of all the potential kind of use cases that this technology has, particularly in the context of whether it's Philips Hue and in consumer homes or whether it's on a larger scale, what do you think are the ones that have the biggest potential, the biggest impact?
Let's start with Philips Hue for a moment, right? So anybody who, I think, Jake, I know you have a Philips Hue set at home, I believe. So, it starts with you acquire, let's say, something like Philips Hue, you want to install it, right? It's quite tedious still. Not that, I think Hue did a fantastic job to make it as simple as possible. It still is,
it's quite a process.
It's just, and I think Dan can talk about it because how many devices you have in your home?
Over 200.
Over 200.
Hue devices.
But Dan doesn't only have Hue, right? He has many other IoT devices. So I think you had a first attempt, let's say, with Alexa, right? Where you had a simplified interface. You say, Alexa, turn on the light. But that, that was 2015 or so, I believe, right? And it kind of got stuck there. So it's still tedious, right? So, and I think what I find really exciting is finally to make it much simpler, to first of set up the lights and then control the lights in conjunction with other IoT devices, right? And all of this would be underneath done by agents. And I think we were really woken up. Who was that who started, just using, in this case, it was Claude Code, to basically, with vibe coding, so to speak, code a simple sequence to commission Hue lights. So that's possible today, right? And it's just the very beginning.
I think it covers the whole spectrum of Signify. In Hue, there's a ton of impacts. I mean, Hans was mentioning, I'm a big home automation, home assistant user. And, if you look at what you can do by tying into Agentic AI to both create U interfaces, create automations, report an issue when there's a problem, very, very impactful for the consumer, especially those that are not geeks like us. The commercial side, there's as we were discussing for buildings and the occupants experience within them. But another big area for Signify is really focusing on customers and how do we make it easier to work with Signify. We're a company, in many cases, by acquisition. We've acquired a lot of brands, and sometimes it's really hard to find a product from us. And we want to make that easier. And when customers need support, being able to find it right away and get that support. And more importantly, providing the best products for the right experience and outcome that our customers are driving for. So making that match, being able to do site audits and with AI and commission systems with AI, all to deliver the experience that our engineers and product managers spend years of their life perfecting, being able to replicate that in our customers' homes and businesses and work life.
With, I guess, across that full spectrum, right, where we've got home, kind of commercial spaces, even wider into cities. We talked before this around occupancy analysis and all these quite surprising things that could be done with a couple of lights and sensors. Maybe from each of you, what's maybe been one of the most surprising or unexpected use cases that we might be able to unlock with kind of agents operating in the system that may not have been possible before?
Well, one, maybe the consumer space is what we launched last year was Motion Aware by Hue. So basically you just, screw in your light bulbs or mount your luminaires, and you don't need a dedicated sensor anymore because the light or the network itself becomes a sensor.
Yeah.
Right? That means you mount them, let's say, throughout your home. And this is an interesting use case for security, for example. You might have a security camera, at your entry door, but the rest of the home, let's say the rooms in the back where you have maybe windows that could also be security issues, they are uncovered. Now, if your whole home is basically one network and is one security mesh, if you want, you can then detect events. Even the camera is only one, let's say, participant in this security scene. And to classify events, to say, okay, there is maybe an incident, you absolutely need AI because otherwise you are drowned in probably clutter of wrong positives.
Yeah.
And that's where I really see, a major step forward, for example, in this security vertical.
Building on that, obviously anonymous occupancy detection has very big potential implications to ensure that an environment is comfortable for an occupant, but also that energy is not just being wasted. And considering the changes over the past 5 to 10 years, especially with people working remotely, with the amount of power requirements for data centers, energy in the grid is really being taxed right now, and it will continue to. So being able to fuse these types of problem statements and solve these problems by using agents to do so, I think is going to really have a big play in the near future.
I think as was mentioned in the kind of introduction as well, I guess one of the reasons that this has such good resonance with actually existing smart lighting or just lighting infrastructure in general is, like you mentioned, they're pretty much everywhere already. They have a constant supply of power, and also you already have a lot of data that's coming in through all those different sources. Hans, you mentioned when we had a previous conversation that that data is great, but unless the quality is there, unless it's labeled properly, classified properly, you still have those issues. So what I wanted to ask from that perspective is, what do you still think are the constraints and things that we need to get over before we can fully realize the potential of this?
Well, you mentioned, for example, the labeling, right? That's you think it's trivial, right? But it's far from, right? So we are in a building right now. How many stories do we have here? Four stories, right? Because you have to see those 4 stories have been equipped maybe in the very beginning, let's say with one lighting layout and maybe one layout for HVAC and so on. But over time, there's renovation going on. So you have a multitude of lighting systems and HVAC and other verticals. So over time, let's say this building, I don't know, is maybe 30 years old. It's a vast variety. Nobody keeps track of that. Nobody, right? Then you come in, let alone is there a floor plan, right? Maybe the floor plan is 20 years old. In the meantime, it has been changed. I don't know how many times. So all of these mandates, that there's ideally accurate data. And that is today one of a really huge threshold. I just come actually from a conference in New York City where there were a lot of architects and lighting designers, and that is one of their major hurdle to implement, to first have reliable data on the ground, to make the right decision. And it, I think, boils back to what you mentioned, Dan, to eventually decide, okay, I want to renovate this room. I would like to have, these type of luminaires. But first I need to have reliable information on the floor plan, on the existing lights, what I want to replace. And again, you would think it's too far from.
Would you say then that kind of bad data or limited data is probably the biggest bottleneck in this context?
I would say it could be limited or missing data, but even, let's say, the tagging, for example, take a very simple example, right? So you're down here, and let's say you have a coffee area, and the lights over the coffee area have been named, coffee area. And then you go in the next floor, and the coffee area is espresso area, let's say, because whoever designed that and labeled that, right, gave it some sort of random name. There is no convention, nothing. So that's actually great about an agent who eventually can make an autonomous decision that espresso and coffee means the same. It's a trivial, maybe not, but you know what I mean, right? It's a trivial example.
And data is really the name of the game for any sort of AI scaled solution. It's the input and the output of AI. And if the core input isn't of good quality, doesn't have context, doesn't have any semantics around it, the output is going to be very poor, and these agents just won't function. So you can't really have AI without data.
Or the right data as well. Well, that's interesting. And so I guess in that context, when we're talking about the availability of data and the crucial nature of that in making any of this work, even though it might seem, not trivial, but ultimately one of the kind of first initial building blocks before you have all this fancy stuff on top of it. What kind of learnings do you think, or that you guys see that you take from how much of a deployment you have on the consumer side, then looking across to kind of buildings or public infrastructure?
Well, I would say obviously there's a huge difference. Right? So we have, of course, a massive deployment of consumer devices, right? And those are in the hands of the consumer. And the functionality around these devices is fairly limited. Whereas on the professional side, the deployments are, I should say, more focused, but the functionality is a lot more critical, as you said. A light in a professional environment, a building, indoor, outdoor, parking lot, right? The city infrastructure must function under any circumstance. And there are a lot more guardrails for that light to function properly. So I think that's a huge difference in requirements, let's say, in a professional setting versus a consumer setting. And hence, the accuracy and the security of the data surrounding that to make the right decision at a given time, also in case of emergencies, for example, is a lot more critical in a professional space than a consumer space.
That makes sense. I guess, like you said, from a security point of view, you have probably those two different ownership challenges there, right? Of someone maybe choosing to implement a system and ultimately put those features in and live under it versus someone walking into a building and have that operating without necessarily someone like yourself, Dan, having put in 200 devices in place and knowing what they're all going to do at the same time. So interesting. With that in mind, we talk about data already and the accuracy, the quality of it needed. What else aside from that? Because we know that now, that's quite a clear thing. What else technically or operationally needs to improve or get up to scratch in order for this to be, more widely realized?
I think the reality is a lot of these systems are, if they're connected in a way that is to specific clouds and they have their own data models and they're not necessarily interoperable with each other. So I think the key enabler is going to be the abstraction of data across these systems, and then having agents leverage that abstracted data to deliver outcomes that are reusable and scalable, because many of the systems in both buildings and homes are siloed, as you will, to how they're operating. And that's going to be the key enabler for this.
If I may add one more dimension to that is, for me, it's also the energy efficiency surrounding it. Just to give you an idea, lighting is now 130, 140 years old. The first light bulb had an efficiency of less than 1%. 99% was heat, right? Today we have 70-75% efficiency. However, now we add, a network to it, we add a sensor to it, etc. And now we add AI agents to it. And so now we basically, all the energy we save, we waste again not waste, but we burn it in data centers, you could argue, right?
Yeah.
So yesterday I actually learned from you and your team, Dan. I thought it was fascinating. How can you become very frugal and super efficient in programming an AI agent? Right. So I think today we're in the very beginning, right? And of course, we basically we burn tokens by the second, so to speak. But in the end, eventually, the efficiency of performing an agentic action, I think, will become super critical.
Yeah.
I don't know, Dan, but I think you study a lot on this, right?
Yeah.
But I think we're also at the very beginning only, right?
A lot of the methods that have been used in cloud and consumption-based technology really apply, and the FinOps practice is really, really important when it comes to building scalable AI solutions. And as these models are expanding and growing, bigger doesn't always mean better, especially for cost. You don't need intense reasoning if you want to keep a room bright enough and cool enough for somebody to be in. So having those levers to be able to adjust along the actual pipelines and workflows is monumental.
So maybe put that back to a bit of wishful thinking then. So if you could wave a magic wand, maybe more in Signify's context, and get over a hurdle that there's in the way at the moment for that, what would it be?
I think we're not yet in a position to answer the question because we haven't hit
Good answer.
Because again, learning from, yesterday we had a review on this topic, we're really at just the very beginning. So I wish we were already in the position to answer your question, but I think we aren't yet.
That's probably a more revealing answer than maybe thought. Yeah. Interesting. And, I know there's an element to this which we certainly wouldn't want you guys to start releasing the secret sauce recipe live over a podcast. But, what are the kinds of things maybe that we should be looking out for in this kind of topic when it comes to Signify and the products there, the engineering?
Well, I think Signify, as it's evolving, is really starting to work together as one. And historically, there's been so many incredible inventions that have come out of the businesses within Signify. And now with our new leadership and a focused effort on how do we work together and how do we leverage technology and especially data across our ecosystem to delight customers. And I think that you're going to see a lot of focus around customers and how do we make their lives better as the core focus for us. And that's where we're going to be applying AI, and data is absolutely critical for that.
Well, Signify is really the only truly global player, right? So if you talk about the widespread application of AI in all the different geographies, and of course there's a lot of, let's say, debate around this today. So we have to tie into all of these debates as a global player, right? Which gives, I think, a special meaning all of these regional implementations, let alone, on a global scale. But we have to play on all of those.
Taking that maybe a bit into the future then. So we are where we are at the moment, as you said, still maybe finding feet in terms of what that's going to manifest. But I will ask maybe a bit of a crystal ball question around 2-3 years ahead, not necessarily from a Signify perspective, but in terms of where this is going. What are the kinds of states that you think we'll see with these systems? Maybe not so time specific, and I won't ask you to put money on it, but what do you think are the kind of aspirations for this?
I think AI is here to stay, and I think it's going to change the world, and we're going to get to that Iron Man Jarvis state. But I also, being in technology my whole life, I've seen how these transformational technologies come and everyone gets very, very excited about it, and a lot of money is put into it. The reality is it takes time for it to develop. IoT for 20 years plus has been top of people's minds, but it didn't really become as strong and prolific until the pandemic. That's when it really, really started to ramp up. Look at the internet in the late 90s. Everybody was coming out with these products that were going to change the world, but the reality is that did happen, but it took years behind the actual hype. So I would say that I would be surprised in the next few years, some of the companies, like the biggest companies now, like the OpenAIs, may not be as important as they are today. The real question is who is going to survive and really be the ones that change the world.
That gets on to, when we look at the kind of economics of that, and certainly in the US, and you look at the top 50 businesses by market capitalization in the US at the moment, the picture changes so much over relatively short time periods. You've got companies like, NVIDIA, OpenAI, others at that stage who just didn't even exist, or certainly weren't anywhere near up there not that long ago. And the pace of that kind of replacement of new businesses, I think the US is a bit of a different context because, in the UK, the top FTSE 100 wasn't looking too dissimilar not so long ago in terms of companies. But the US, you see that pace of change. And I think you're right it's really all to play for, certainly in the next 2-3 years. And the use cases that will come out in the wash, as they say, will be ones that we couldn't have even sat here thinking about.
And I would make a bit of an alert there because you pointed to, the Magnificent Seven, basically, the large seven. In the US, the players. Today, it's a bit like driven by, the bigger, better is the better, right? So if you take OpenAI, how many trillion of parameters can you crunch? If you look at China, obviously also limited by access, let's say, to NVIDIA infrastructure, they took a different approach and they basically say, let's see what we can do with what we have. And I have to say, we are a close observer of that. It's phenomenal what you can do with even one generation back, so to speak. So I would not be surprised, if eventually over time, with all the tools we have available already today, there will be new players emerging that know how to most economically apply those for certain use cases. And as I said, we've seen some of these first examples. DeepSeek, obviously, in China is a good example, right? But there will be more.
So I think that's quite a nice note on which maybe to bring it from that future point back to today then. So I did ask this question before, so hopefully I haven't come out of the blue with it. But for both of you, maybe, what do you think of this conversation, this topic at the moment, Signify, context or otherwise, is the main thing that you think people should take away from this conversation? Maybe just to stew on and have a bit of a think about.
Let me put it a bit in a historic context. So as I said, I just come from a conference in New York, and that's also where Thomas Alva Edison in 1878 switched on the first light, and it was magic, right? It's never happened before. So he built a little power plant right in the middle of New York City to power the first street lights. And it was magic to people then. And then, in 1891, Philips started in Holland doing exactly the same thing. And so, the last 100 or so years, lighting evolved into what we just described in the past half hour or so, into this extremely complex infrastructure. My dream would be that with the help of AI and AI agents, we actually go back to where we started. That lighting is as simple as switching on one switch. And making that magic happen again without taking away all the complexity underneath. Of course, it needs to happen today in all these buildings and so on, but the simplicity of, I turn on a light and it's simply light out there, and that's what people like and experience. I hope that we can eventually, after this journey of 150 years, come back to a bit of this magic again.
One switch to power them all.
In a way, but what I mean with the equivalent of that, right? But to experience that simplicity, go away from all this complexity, and let the agent in the background do the work.
Do everything else. Yeah, I like that. Dan, am I putting you on the spot by asking the same thing?
I think the unique position that Signify has, being probably the largest sensor network in commercial real estate and the largest IoT connected deployments in the consumer space, I think that there's a real opportunity to connect various systems and capabilities together, and us help enabling and being that bridge. I think AI is really helping accelerate that for us, being that we're a company that was founded in innovation, and we're going to leverage these innovation technologies to transform the experiences we deliver to customers and how we operate as a company. So I'm very encouraged, and being a lifelong IoT person, and it's a great privilege to work for Signify and be able to have this type of impact.
Well, I think that's a great final point, guys. Look, it's been a great conversation. Really appreciated having both your time here to talk about this. And there's a lot in it. I'm sure we could probably go on for another hour or two in a different life. But I think we've covered a solid cross section of what we're talking about with Agentic AI, what it means in practice, how it can start to change those systems, and hopefully what we're looking to see out of it in the future. So, I think one of the other interesting things, particularly, is that this isn't happening in isolation, right? It's having to be layered onto existing infrastructure for better or worse. Old buildings, new technology, and there's a lot of work to do here. So great conversation, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves for sure. So for both of you, thanks very much again, coming on, sharing your perspectives. And for everyone listening, as always, if you found this useful, please feel free, share it with someone who might be working in this space or interested. And we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.